going to talk just briefly about the theory of island biogeography and how you might construct a study, or you might find a study system that is amenable to doing a project asking questions about island biogeography. Now, the theory of island biogeography was developed by two very famous ecologists, Robert MacArthur and E.O. Wilson, in the late 1960s, 1967, and they made a null hypothesis prediction of how many species you would find on an oceanic island. And there were two main aspects of the island that would predict how many species you would find. And one would be the distance of the island to a mainland, and the other would be the size of the island. And these two factors are independent of one another. And so their prediction was, here's a mainland. On islands that are far from a mainland, they have much lower colonization rates than islands that are near a mainland. And you can think of birds flying away from a mainland, or seeds dispersing by the wind from a mainland. And any of these predictions would predict that you're going to get more species closer to the mainland than you will on an island that is farther away from a mainland, just because the probability of those seeds or animals or whatever actually making it to that farther mainland are lower. Okay. So that's your colonization rate as it relates to distance. Now, the other aspect is island size, and this has to do with the closest thing we have to a rule in ecology, and that's called the species area effect. As you sample a larger and larger area for species, you find more and more species. And so let's just say this is our sort of set distance. At a set distance, so given that the distance is the same in two places, a small island is going to have fewer species on it than a large island. And that's because even if a lot of species, the same number of species are colonizing these two islands, there just isn't enough space on the smaller island to hold as many species. So your extinction rates are higher on this smaller island. So that's going to have fewer species because it has a higher extinction rate. And this one will have more species because it has a lower extinction rate. So when they modeled this, they drew this nifty diagram. And sometimes you'll find that the lines that I'm plotting as straight lines actually occur as exponential curves, because they actually did find that this was more of an exponential relationship. But I'm going to draw this pattern as straight lines. Pretend that we've transformed the data. So if you have a graph like this, and we basically have two y-axes and one x-axis. And this one is number, the x-axis is number of species, okay? And then on the y-axis, we have two things. We have colonization. I'm gonna write this. It's gonna be useful for you to see the full writing. And then extinction. Okay, so we can set this up this way. Okay, colonization and extinction. And so on a island that is near a mainland, you're going to have high colonization rates. Okay, and an island that's far from a mainland, you're going to have lower colonization rates. So that's high colonization rates near a mainland, and then lower colonization rates far from a mainland. So here's your near and your far line. Likewise, you make these predictions about extinction rates. You're going to have higher extinction rates on smaller islands, okay? And then you're going to have lower extinction rates on large islands, lower extinction rates on large islands. So here's your small island, and here's your large island. Okay. And so you can actually follow these lines, and where you find the lines crossing, that's where you have a balance between colonization and extinction. And so that's what we call your equilibrium number of species. The actual species that are present on these islands of this, where these lines cross, can change over time, but the number tends to stay constant. So that island can only hold as that many species as is balanced by colonization and extinction. So let's follow these lines for a minute. I'm going to start here with the near island near a mainland. If I trace that line down to where it intersects with a small island, okay, so this is an island near a mainland, but it is small. You can actually see this equilibrium number and trace it down here. And this is your near small equilibrium number of species right here. We haven't set what that number of species is because it depends on the organisms you're looking at. You can then trace this near island line down to large. So a near large island is going to have your highest numbers of species in these comparisons. And you drop down here. Here's your number of species. And so this will say this is a lot. And this is none at this end. Okay. So you have many more species on islands that are near mainlands that are large. Okay. If we trace this far from a mainland line, so these are far islands, where a small far islands on the other end are on the other end of the spectrum. They're both small, so they have these high extinction rates, and they're far, so they have low colonization rates. And so you're going to find your fewest numbers of species on the far islands that are small. If I continue to trace this down here to far large islands, so this is far small, this is far large, okay? And I made these two lines separate, but they could be almost overlapping. Your number of species is somewhere in the middle because the island's large, it has low extinction rates, but it's also far away from a mainland. So it's not getting as many species as those large islands that are near a mainland. And so you can make these sorts of predictions. So when this theory first arose, they looked at lots of data sets, MacArthur and Wilson, of different groups of plants and animals on oceanic islands. And they modeled how many species would be predicted based on their distance and their size. But they did propose at the end of their project, at this monograph that they wrote, that you could apply this theory possibly to terrestrial ecosystems or other ecosystems where you find patches of habitat. And lots of people have done studies looking at that since then. In fact, the whole field of the study of fragmentation has this underlying theme of the theory of island biogeography. So let's say we have a similar system here, but instead of a mainland, we have a large forest. And I'm thinking of the Pacific Northwest with its forestry industry. So we have a large forest here. And then in this area, we have a clear cut. Okay, within the clear cut, you often find that trees are left behind in clear cuts. And they're left behind to provide seed so that that clear cut can regenerate. And you can go to clear cuts all over the place and you can find trees. You might find clusters of trees that are very small, there's just one tree, or you might find clusters that are very large, 50, 60 trees. Sometimes they're very large, okay? And by the same token, you can actually find patches of trees or seed trees that are left behind that are closer to the edge of a forest and further away from the edge of a forest. And within that system, you can make predictions about how many species you're going to find. And so it's just a trick of figuring out which taxa would be really useful to be looking at and setting up your design carefully. Something also to consider when you're doing these sorts of studies in terrestrial ecosystems is looking at what they call nearest neighbor distances. So just having an estimate of how far away not only is each patch from the forest edge, but how far away are the patches from each other. And there are a lot of very simple GIS tools that you can use to get an idea of the size of these islands and their distance from a forest edge. Google Earth has lots of tools, and there are a lot of other tools that you can use through ArcGIS to get these estimates, as well as distances from one another. So that's a really neat survey design. There have also been projects that have looked at a much smaller scale with invasive species, where there may be somebody was involved in invasive species removal and were able to remove that invasive species in a system that replicated the theory of island biogeography. So in particular, there have been Scotch broom projects where maybe what you started with was this huge clump of Scots broom, and a intentional pattern of clearing happened where this was maybe left behind and then some smaller and larger patches of Scotch broom left behind after it was cleared. And you could look at insect communities, for example, in this kind of system and make some fun predictions. All right, that's it.